Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I appreciate y'all joining us tonight. I want to apologize that it's been a couple months since we've done one of these. Um, it's also been a couple months since we put out any content on the podcast. Casey, Ritchie, and myself have just been insanely busy and have had a lot of things coming up. We had rap session, we had some different route inspection classes going on, and so just, you plan on doing something next week and then three things pop up and then you plan on doing something a little bit after that and then more things come up. And so that's just kind of how it goes sometimes. But what we're going over today is we're just going to kind of touch on Article 16, the just cause principles. I'm not going to be trying to reinvent the wheel or anything. I'm just going to kind of go over some of the basics that for a lot of people will be beneficial. And give me just a moment here. Okay, great. I just got that from Joyce. Yes, Joyce, I'll send that to you. And so I'm going to share my screen here. Before I do that, so like I was talking a few minutes ago to Reese here. Um, Whenever you get discipline, your blueprint is Article 16, the just cause principles. No matter what type of discipline it is, if it's something you've handled before and you see it and you're like, oh, okay, I got this, you always want to go through the just cause principles and make sure it lines up to it. Occasionally, discipline will meet, all the just cause principles. Many times it will not. And so instead of trying to figure it out on your own or just going, well, I've handled this two or three times, it's always helpful to pause and just kind of crack open Article 16 and just read each one of them. And I'm going to share my screen here. Rock and rolling. Okay. So right here in Article 16 is where these just cause principles are. And I'm just going to kind of read some of this with you here, and then we'll just kind of pause for a moment and maybe give some commentary. Um, just cause principle, the principle that any discipline must be for, quote, just cause, unquote, establishes a standard that must apply to any discipline or discharge of an employee. Simply put, the just cause provision requires a fair and provable justification for discipline. Just cause is a term of art created by labor arbitrators. It has no precise definition. It contains no rigid rules that apply in the same way in each case of discipline or discharge. However, arbitrators frequently divide the question of just cause into six sub-questions and often apply the following criteria to determine whether the action was for just cause. These criteria are the basic considerations that the supervisor must use before initiating disciplinary action. And a lot of the disciplines I've seen and grievances I've filed, management actually has a physical checklist. A lot of times they use, and they kind of go through, is there a rule? Is the rule consistently equitably enforced? And they just kind of go through it. And a lot of times they just pencil whip it. They just put the check mark in there, whether or not they have met this just cause idea. But, and there's books that have been written on just cause. Ken Mayfield, our union president, recently shared a book with me, and it really goes into some detail. This could be a very deep topic. We're just going to kind of brush the surface of it tonight. But, the idea of just cause, it's a constraint on management. It's so that they cannot just have an open-ended, unbridled authority to issue discipline whenever they want. That's what makes having a union job different than having a non-union job. Non-union job, you upset the supervisor, he can write you up for, he doesn't like the way your teeth look. But if you're, obviously a letter carrier and, the contract is there and that's rules that management and the carriers have to abide by, they can't do that. They have to follow this rigid guideline. And even though, I say rigid, there's not, every situation's a little different. But, kind of the first point here, is there a rule? The words that follow after that are very important because it really kind of breaks down more of the details. Because you ask yourself, is there a rule? So maybe they issue a letter of warning for, failure to follow instructions. They told a carrier to go carry overtime. He looked at them and said, I'm out, deuces, and then walks out the door. Well, there is a rule that we have to obey their, instructions. If they issue discipline for stationary events, Well, you're going to be hard pressed to find a rule somewhere in any handbook or manual, addressing a quote unquote stationary event or an idle event time where your scanner wasn't moving. So that would be an example of potentially discipline being issued, which they did at our station for somebody for stationary events. And the steward at the time, that was one of his biggest contentions. He's like, what rule did they break? You haven't cited anything. And so if you read along with me here, is there a rule? If so, was the employee aware of the rule? Now that's real important too, because especially let's say you have a CCA or a carrier that hasn't been here a long time, they're supposed to ask in the investigative interview if they're aware of certain regulations or certain rules that were violated, allegedly. And, sometimes carriers in the II will just kind of go, oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Um, well, are they aware of the rule? Like it's one thing to say, I've heard of the ELM, I've heard of the M41, and they just answer yes to that. But if they issue discipline, if I have a pretty good feeling that the employee was not aware of the rule, I'll request time to interview them. And I'll actually ask them before the before management, quoted the ELM to you in this certain provision, had you ever heard of it before that investigative interview? And if so, what type of understanding did you have of it? And then right after that, was the employee forewarned of the disciplinary consequences for failure to follow the rule? And it continues. It's not enough to say, well, everybody knows that rule, or we posted that rule 10 years ago. And then it says here, you may have to prove that the employee should have known of the rule. Now, of course, this is not, and it goes on, this is not talking about throwing away mail, insubordination, fighting, being intoxicated on the clock. Those things, it's pretty much understood universally. If you were intelligent enough to get hired for the job and to put your shoes on and walk through the door, you're going to be intelligent enough to understand it's against the rules, to drink and drive while you're on the clock. It's against the rules to throw mail away. But really outside of those, the examples it gives here, what does it say? For example, an employee charged with intoxication on duty, fighting on duty, pilferage, sabotage, insubordination, etc., may be generally assumed to have understood that these offenses are neither condoned nor acceptable, even though management may not have issued specific regulations to that effect. So really, if it's kind of anything outside of that realm, this whole thing, was the employee forewarned of the disciplinary consequences for failure to follow this rule? So if you're interviewing them, if you have a good idea that they didn't know about the rule, even though they may have said yes in the II, you can interview them and kind of dig into it a little bit and be like, what was your understanding of the consequences for, X, Y, and Z? And that might bring out some information that would be helpful in their defense, mitigating circumstances. So the first one is always, is there a rule? And then it goes a little deeper. Did the employee know what would happen if they didn't follow it? So it kind of implies a little bit more than just a glancing surface knowledge, but they really have to have understanding. And so that's one of the first things here. The next one, is the rule a reasonable rule? Management must make sure rules are reasonable, based on the overall objective of safe and efficient performance. Management's rules should be reasonably related to business efficiency, safe operation of our business, and the performance we might expect of the employee. So if it's a rule that they can cite in a handbook and manual, I'm going to say, it's a reasonable rule. There may be some situations, though, where management, tells maybe a carrier that they can't smoke in the smoking area, where there's clearly a sign up that says this is the designated smoking area for 39th Street Station. And they just arbitrarily, well, no, you can't smoke over there anymore, even though there's still a sign there and even though other people are smoking there. And that really kind of goes into the next one. I guess I'm kind of getting ahead. Is the rule consistently and equitably enforced? But before I talk about that, is the rule a reasonable rule? It's worth stopping and thinking about, whatever they're accusing them with. Because occasionally, there was a grievance I had in Edmond where a carrier dropped his scanner out of his satchel, and they were trying to get him for failure to follow instructions. And they were trying to say that because he accidentally dropped it out of his holster, that he wasn't following the instruction to keep your scanner on you at all times. If they tried saying that you need to duct tape it to your chest, and that's the new rule, and then he violated it, I'm going to make the argument that's not a reasonable rule. You're taking, a failure to follow scenario and just running wild with it and doing something silly. So, you may run into instances where kind of a crazy interpretation of their authority is going to present itself, if that makes sense. But as I was saying, is the rule consistently and equitably enforced? A rule must be applied fairly and without discrimination. Consistent and equitable enforcement is a critical factor. And let me stop there. Kind of like with my example about smoking in the smoking area. If other employees are allowed to smoke over there, but for some reason Eric Robinson is not, they made a new rule up about it that I can't go over there. That would be an example of them not equitably enforcing it. Another one would maybe be if they try to give discipline for unauthorized overtime. Carrier maybe went 15 minutes over what they anticipated, on their 96 when they turned one in, or a verbal conversation they had with management. So they decided to issue discipline for it. Well, as the steward at your station, let's say there's a common practice where typically people are allowed to go 10, 15 minutes over. I kind of know at my station, that's kind of the rule of thumb. You want to kind of hit what you tell them you're going to do. But our management does understand you may run into traffic. You may have to take an extra bathroom stop. So typically there's kind of a 15-minute window. I mean, obviously they don't want people just, using overtime whenever they want without, getting it approved. But in that scenario, if they were to allow me to do that, if they were allowed Ken to do it, if they were allowed Danny to do it, but for some reason, they're going to jump all over Andy, when he does it, I'm going to be able to tear that apart. I'm going to get statements from the other carriers saying, hey, how long has this been going on? Have you ever been spoken to about it? Has management ever made a big deal of this before? And so that could be one way that you would kind of look at, is this rule being equitably enforced? If a carrier gets disciplined for calling in 3 times in a quarter, but for a fact that there's 3 other carriers that have had unexcused absences that exceed that amount and they didn't get any discipline. The idea is not that you're going to go in there with management and be like, hey, you got to give these other people discipline too. What you're going to be saying is, you kind of have 2 standards here. You're allowing this group of people more leniency when it comes to the attendance policy. But now with this carrier, you're throwing the book at them for, just a couple of call-ins. So when you have discipline, that's absolutely one of the little, rules you want to see if it holds up against. And, it says here, consistently overlooking employee infractions and then disciplining without warning is improper. Let's say that same scenario where for a long time at a certain station, if you go a little bit over your 96 and nobody says anything because they trust that you're working, which, we are, and then all of a sudden out of the blue, they start issuing discipline for it. You can put in a request to interview the carriers again and ask them, hey, all of a sudden you got disciplined for this. Have they ever told you before that this is unacceptable? And so you might see where they try to do that just out of the blue. And really the proper way to do it would be them to have a discussion with the station saying, hey, going forward, starting Monday, starting today, starting tomorrow, we're going to enforce this a little differently. We're going to have to tighten up a little bit. And that's their right. They're allowed to manage. But to not forewarn an employee of the consequences of violating a rule, and then just out of the blue doing it, you're going to be able to kind of pick that apart and attack that a little bit. And it's funny, maybe that's where I got the smoking thing from. It says right here, if employees are consistently allowed to smoke in areas designated as non-smoking areas, it's not appropriate to start disciplining them for this violation. In such cases, management loses its right to discipline for that infraction, in effect, unless it first puts employees and the unions on notice of its intent to enforce that regulation again. Singling out employees for discipline is usually improper. If several similarly sorry about that. It's been a long day. Situated employees committed an offense, it would not be equitable to discipline only one. I know recently, a few months back, they gave a stand-up talk saying that it's an expectation that we wear green tag shoes, and that going forward, if anybody was seen without green tag shoes on, black leather shoes, I think they also said that they would be subject to discipline. So if they just would have showed up on a Monday and started handing out, discipline, conducting IIs and disciplining people for not wearing green tag shoes. But when for the last 9.5 years at my station, it's been, no one said a word about it, and management's clearly been aware, that would be an example of them not consistently enforcing a rule. So you always want to kind of, think that through whenever you get discipline, if, how they've been enforcing it in the past. The next one was a thorough investigation completed. Now, a lot of times this is something you can really sink your teeth into. And we could have a 2-hour training on was a thorough investigation completed by itself. When they issue discipline, you don't want to ever automatically assume, even if the carrier's guilty of what, the letter of warning may say at the top, you don't want to assume that they've met just cause. They can't just issue discipline because someone's guilty of something. They're only allowed to issue discipline if it also meets just cause. And a lot of times their investigation management, because they believe someone's guilty, because maybe a carrier even admitted to what they're telling them about, they'll just, completely blow through investigating to find out all the facts. Because there could be a reason why the employee violated the rule. There could have been some type of mitigating circumstance that they need to take in mind. And it says here, before administering the discipline, management must make an investigation to determine whether the employee committed the offense. Management must ensure that its investigation is thorough and objective. I've met with management before, and I've pointed out that their objectivity was lacking. That they had an interaction with the carrier before, kind of veiled threats, but maybe not crossing that line, but just getting right up to it. And then that same supervisor does an II, ask accusatory questions throughout it. Why are you guilty? Why did you choose not to, perform your duties properly? And that just screams that they're not conducting an objective investigation. It says here, this is the employee's day in court privilege. Employees have the right to know with reasonable detail what the charges are and to be given a reasonable opportunity to defend themselves before the discipline is initiated. When I have my caucus with a carrier before the investigative interview, I make it clear to them that this is kind of like their day in court. Don't just say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then at the end, is there anything you'd like to add? No. So you can get out of there and go get to your route. Be thoughtful with your answers. Consider the questions that are being posed to you. And, use this opportunity to present your side of the story. And, when you look at questions, because when you get an information request, you're going to get the II notes. And if you're the one that did the II, you'll have the steward's copy. You want to take your time and go through it and, really kind of pick it apart. Eric Bew tells me all the time, whenever we get discipline, you're just looking to kind of poke holes in it. It's almost kind of like you're testing it. Use this Article 16 to see if any holes can be poked through it. If you can't, then guess what? They probably had just cause. And then you're in a situation where now you're not talking about whether or not the discipline was justified. Now you're in a situation of the severity of the correction that they're trying to achieve. The next one. Well, it's kind of funny. Once you do this for a little bit, it almost kind of becomes second nature, like it gets ground into you. The very next question, was the severity of the discipline reasonably related to the infraction itself and in line with that usually administered, as well as to the seriousness of the employee's past record? And the following is an example of what arbitrators may consider an inequitable discipline. If an installation consistently issues 5-day suspensions for a particular offense, it'd be extremely difficult to justify why an employee with a past record similar to that of other disciplined employees was issued a 30-day suspension for the same offense. There is no precise definition of what establishes a good, fair, or bad record. Reasonable judgment must be used. An employee's record of previous offenses may never be used to establish guilt in a case you previously have under consideration, but it may be used to determine the appropriate disciplinary penalty. So you have two carriers. One of them has been a regular for 6 months. The other one has been a regular for 37 years. This concept of a bank of goodwill, I have used that successfully with the carrier that's been there more than 30 years, saying, well, hey, look, when was the last time he got disciplined? Furthermore, when was the last time he even had an investigative interview? I had a carrier earlier this year in the spring. That was the scenario. He literally could not remember if he had ever had an II, and he was pretty upset about even having an II. So when they issued the discipline, that was the first thing I brought up. I was like, what are we even doing here? Like, this is such a minor thing. Why couldn't you just pull him to the side and talk to him about it? Why are we resorting to discipline? This guy was delivering mail when I was 6 years old, and I'm 42. And so this bank of goodwill, how long they've been an employee and their record, you always want to look at that and consider it, because many times you'll be able to use that. Now, once again, the employee that's only been employed for a year, you're not going to be able to say in the same way that they have decades of faithful service. Now, you can still, and I still would bring up, hey, they've been here for 12 months. They have never been caught not curbed, they've never been caught with wheels that were not curbed on their vehicle. Did you ask them why they weren't curbed? You didn't ask that question. No, you just asked them if they were. Once again, thorough investigation. But then I would ask that question, why were they not curbed? Well, there was a bee in the vehicle, and, I was just trying to turn it off and pull it over so I could jump out as soon as possible. Then I forgot to, go back in and start it back up and curb them. So you never know why they did something. And a lot of times management doesn't care why they did it, and sometimes they won't even ask why they did it. But once again, if it's that same carrier that's been there for 37 years in the same scenario, I'm going to have a much easier time getting that discipline thrown out just because of how long they've been there. So anyway, not to beat that to death, but that's a big one. And this last one, was a disciplinary action taken in a timely manner? Disciplinary action should be taken as promptly as possible after the offense has been committed. There's no timeline on it. We had a vehicle accident. They waited 9 days to do the II. They then waited 11 days after that to issue the discipline. Part of what I argued was, you're wanting to give them discipline for this automobile accident, but you waited a week and a half to ask them what happened. You waited a week and a half to ask them what was going on. Then 10 days later, you issue the discipline. So the event happens. 20 days later, they get disciplined. What that tells me is you don't think this was a serious infraction. Because if you thought it was a serious infraction, wouldn't you be doing the investigative interview before you even let them behind the wheel of a vehicle again? If you think this is serious enough to issue, a letter of warning, or in this case, it was a 7-day suspension, why would we wait 20 days? Why would we wait 3 weeks? Well, that screams punitive. It says right here, the very next thing, corrective rather than punitive. The requirement that discipline be corrective rather than punitive is an essential element of the just cause principle. And just to be clear, corrective, that, it's to fix a problem. Punitive, punishment. So it says here it's an essential element of these principles. And in short, it means that for most offenses, management must issue discipline in a progressive fashion, issuing lesser discipline, i.e. a letter of warning for a first offense, and a pattern of increasingly severe discipline for succeeding offenses: short suspension, long suspension, termination. The basis of this principle of corrective or progressive discipline is that it is issued for the purpose of correcting or fixing the problem, improving employee behavior, and not as punishment or retribution. So that's kind of going to kind of be the scope of tonight's training, is just kind of that portion of Article 16. I would totally encourage you guys, if you haven't, to go through and read the rest of Article 16 and kind of dig into it for yourself, because there's other really good things in there we can use to combat discipline. Um, this whole thing, to touch on that last point, though, that I read, the corrective rather than punitive, I've been kind of successful with that with grievances on discipline, pointing out, you know, how is this discipline going to stop them from, XYZ? Um, a lot of times, I'm trying to think of an example. Had a carrier scraped his vehicle up against an object, and management issued a severe form of discipline. Carrier had never had an issue with this before. Carrier gave a really good explanation on why it happened. So my first thing is okay, you asked them what happened. They said there were pedestrians nearby and they, turned the wheel a little sharp to avoid them. There was an oncoming vehicle as well. And so they were really paying attention to those two, I don't want to call it distractions, but those two, potential hazards, of hitting someone. It's reasonable to think that he might misjudge, another object that he might scrape the vehicle up against. And so, what I was asking the supervisor, I was like, how is issuing this going to correct, that type of situation? Is this going to cause the pedestrians not to jump out in front of his vehicle? Is this going to cause, that the oncoming traffic to be a little further away from the postal vehicle next time? And so, I didn't hang my hat on that whole thing, but I made a really strong point about it. That if you're trying to correct something for such it just scraped the vehicle. It was such a minor thing, and they wanted to give severe discipline. So, always consider, whether this is meant to fix a problem or if it's punishment. And one other thought I had on the disciplinary action taken in a timely manner. I mean, if they issue discipline 6 months later, I'm going to assume that we could probably be successful in arguing that it was not taken in a timely manner. They issue something 3 weeks later, a month later. I mean, you're going to want to argue it. It's going to be different than if they issued it 6 months later. There could be reasons why they didn't issue it, why they didn't do the II. Maybe the carrier, was out on vacation for 2 weeks. I mean, you don't want them to call them at home and order them to come in for an II, right? So, sometimes there could be reasons, but you always want to think about that as well and, make the case if you can. Now, the next thing I'm going to share on the screen here, this is a just cause checklist that I got from a rap session, and I don't remember which one it was. This was intended, if I remember correctly, for people that were writing contentions for Formal A to go up to Step B. But when I was kind of looking through this past week, when I was kind of going through the material, what to talk to you guys about, I just thought this would be really good to share with you guys and email you all a copy. And for anyone that ends up listening to this via the podcast, if, later down the line, if you want a copy of this, if you send an email to our podcast email address, I can make sure that we get that to you. The email address is 458podcast@gmail.com. And so I'm just going to kind of briefly go through this with you guys. The Just Cause checklist. This checklist is meant to help focus your contentions on the Just Cause provisions contained in Article 16 in the JCAM. For best results, we recommend you utilize this checklist as you write your contentions, then proceeding to the next item as you compose your contentions around the ideas discussed in the checklist. So the way I'd want you all to think about this, because most of what I do is informal A grievances, anytime when you see the word contentions, it just means argument. And so, before I meet on discipline, I always take a piece of paper and I write out my arguments in advance. I make myself little bullet points, almost like an outline, so that when I'm in there, I don't get sidetracked or distracted and forget to bring up something that's relevant that might help us win, our grievance. So as we go through here, just kind of keep in mind, help focus your contentions, help focus your arguments on the just cause provisions. And, it says here, keep in mind that as you go through the checklist, that management has the burden at each and every step to prove that all of the just cause elements have been met prior to issuing any discipline, and that due process rights of the carrier are not infringed. And that's another thing to really keep in mind is that the burden of proof's on them with discipline. You'll go in to meet on a discipline, and a lot of times management will try to flip it around on you to get you to prove, why they shouldn't have discipline, to kind of try to get you to prove, their innocence. And that's not the case at all. Contract cases, yes, the burden of proof's on us. We're the ones that have to make the arguments that are persuasive with this. But when it comes to justifying their discipline, they can't just say because. And I literally had a supervisor one time be like, well, I just feel like he deserves something. I wrote a statement whenever we went up to Formal A and we were successful with the grievance. They still got disciplined, but I would like to think that it could have been a lot worse if we didn't have that statement in there about it. But, this checklist, I'm just going to kind of go through it briefly with you. First thing, did the grievant act as charged? So they accuse the carrier of failure to follow an instruction. So, is this true? Did the carrier admit to it? Look at your II notes. Look at any interview that you had with the carrier. Think about any phone call you may have had with the carrier. If they didn't act as charged, as you got to kind of see on A there, if not, focus your contentions on this point. And so when you would go in to meet on the discipline, you'd be like, hey, you said they did this. They didn't do this. I have proof they didn't do this. I have 3 statements from the carriers that were on the workroom floor saying the guy did not cuss the supervisor out. That the second one there, B, if yes, so if the grievant did act as charged, was it intentional? Did the grievant act intentionally? So as you kind of see here, if yes, proceed to point 2. So if they did act as charged, point 2, is the rule cited in the disciplinary notice? And I have used this in the past when I was a little bit earlier on with working grievances because I didn't want to miss something. I didn't want to overlook something because, we get a lot going on in your personal life, carrying mail. You might have multiple grievances in the pipeline at once. And I don't ever want to be in a position where I drop the ball for someone because I forgot to bring up, one of the just cause elements that might have tore the whole thing apart and got it thrown out or gotten it reduced. So just kind of through here, is the rule cited is in the disciplinary notice? And it says here, if not, congratulations, argue this in your contentions. Bring up that what they're charging them with is not on the 7-day suspension. It's not listed anywhere on the letter of removal. You're talking about the guy not being regular in attendance, but then the discipline letter is failure to uphold postal policies. Well, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges here. Management will still do it sometimes, but that's something you'd want to argue. You go through here, was the employee aware of the rule when the alleged offense occurred? And as you can tell by some of the verbiage on this is all, like it said, the just cause checklist. This is keeping all that in mind and just kind of putting it in a little outline for you when you're working the discipline. Go down a little bit more. Was the employee forewarned of the consequences for failing to comply with the rules cited? And then it tells you right here, if not, talk about it in your contentions. You'd bring up the point that, hey, he said very clearly he did not know that was a no-no. He had no idea that he wasn't supposed to be doing that. The day you said he had a stand-up talk, I checked the clock rings, he wasn't even there. So clearly, we can believe him that he said he didn't know, and you can't prove that you did forewarn him, because keep in mind, the burden of proof's on them. If they're going to say he did know about it, you got to prove it. The II, that's one way they can prove it. And if he tells them he didn't do it, they got to give me another way to prove that he's lying. And so either way, I'm going to email this to you guys here in just a little bit. I've kind of come to the end of the material. It wasn't going to be a full hour because I just kind of wanted to loosely go over all this and not put anybody to sleep. But this hopefully will be helpful. And so that's about it for tonight's training. Next month, I'm planning on doing another Zoom. I don't know the topic yet. I've thought about, because we've been kind of going through, this anatomy of a grievance, each step the II, the information requests, working the grievance. Today, kind of going a little bit more in detail on this just cause principles that you're going to want to use on every discipline grievance. Really kind of the next step is, the meeting with management. And so we may talk about that. Yeah, that'll probably be a good idea. Well, you all take it easy. You have a good night.